I personally have been absolutely delighted to be associated with this programme because in my own career in politics and public life, I came to the appreciation that the role of faith in society and of religions is insufficiently understood, insufficiently discussed, insufficiently considered when decisions are being taken in a wide variety of areas in public life. And I strongly support the aspiration of this research programme to get informed discussion about the place of religion in our national life to a much higher level. Here in this area, radicalisation is an area absolutely close to my heart because as Home Secretary I was involved particularly as a result of the 7/7 attacks in a wide set of debates about how the state and how society as a whole should deal with the place of religion in society and deal with the threats that we faced. There were very hard debates in Parliament and elsewhere about the way in which we should be dealing with the challenges and threats that we faced, and concerns that if we did it wrongly, that we'd end up with a state of affairs that significant communities were alienated by the approach that we'd followed, or if we didn't do it adequately, that we wouldn't identify threats that came. And these debates ran in Parliament very strongly indeed. I don't think any government has really got it right fully so far, but I'm absolutely delighted that we'll have research being presented this evening which comments on how that has gone, and we'll be able to have very authoritative response from people who've thought about those issues.
The Religion and Society programme has sponsored a semi-autonomous website which is called radicalisationresearch.org. That's one word, and I do encourage you to have a look at that. Radicalisationresearch.org. We've got both the American and the UK spellings, and you can find that online right now. Matthew Francis, who's speaking tonight, has been important in that, and so have all our speakers, actually. And the idea of that was that we didn't just want to commission more new research, there was an awful lot of research going on, and it's just exploded, of course, in the period since we started. And the idea of our website is to consolidate that. Tonight gives us a chance, on the basis of these various initiatives, to stand back a little bit and say, what have we learnt from this explosion of research about the topic? And let me make just two brief comments before handing over to the speakers who will tell you about that, answer that question. The first thing just to note is that this is a topic which has its own word, radicalisation. And in a way, I think you can place research and researchers somewhere along a spectrum between those who think that that's a good and appropriate thing, that there is this special word, and those who think that's a rather unhelpful thing. And the first camp like having their own word because they believe that we are dealing with something that is radically new and distinct, perhaps discrete. The second camp dislike the word because they think it obscures its continuity with other phenomena. It obscures the fact that it's just a type of terrorism, or that we know things about new religious movements already that we should be taking account of, or whatever. So in the first case is about exceptionalising the phenomenon. The second case, there are lots of people who are trying to de-exceptionalise the phenomenon and say, we already know quite a lot about that, let's learn from it. And I think actually most of our researchers tonight fall more into that second de-exceptionalising camp, but you can make up your minds. My second point is that there's another reason why the term radicalisation is controversial, and that's because it casts the net very wide. It suggests that the holding of radical beliefs is itself dangerous and a cause for state concern. And that's been manifest in the Prevent part of the UK government's approach to dealing with radicalisation. And as you'll hear, again, I think the consensus from our speakers on this side, the researchers tonight, is that the breadth, the lack of focus in Prevent has been costly and perhaps even dangerous.
Until 2007, I was living and teaching in Cairo and researching the history of terrorism. In 2007, I moved back to Europe, and since then I've been researching not so much radicalisation as policies designed to prevent it, and especially the assumptions on which these are based. One problem that struck me immediately was that there was absolutely no consensus on what radicalization actually was, and not even on what radical means. This may sound like a tiresome academic quibble. After all, it could be replied, we all know what's radical when we see it. But actually it isn't like that, as different people very clearly regard different things as radical. And this is a problem, as if we don't even know what it is that we're trying to counter, we're unlikely to be very successful in countering it. And we may, as Linda said, even make things worse by trying to counter what it is counterproductive to counter. What sort of activities and attitudes need to be countered, and what can be countered? This seems to me to be a better question to ask than how do we define radicalism. Something that struck me in 2007, when I came back to Europe from Cairo, was that many of the political and religious views that were regarded as radical in Europe were views that I encountered routinely in Cairo. It was generally accepted by most Egyptians, for example, that there was a clash of civilizations going on between Islam and the West. Strict Saudi-inspired interpretations of Islam, of the variety that are now generally called Salafism, were also quite normal. The narrative of the clash of civilizations is central to the milieu from which jihadist terrorism derives, and the milieu in which it finds its support. It's today's equivalent of the socialism from which anarchist terrorism once derived. It's also a narrative that, in modified form, can inspire other sorts of terrorism, as anyone who read the manifesto of Anders Behring Breivik will have seen. However, that narrative on its own is not enough to produce terrorism. Only a tiny percentage of the millions of Egyptians who accept this narrative have even thought for a minute that they personally should take some active part in the clash that they think is going on, and even fewer have actually done so. The problem is not the narrative or the Salafism, then, but the people who accept and promote the idea that violence is the proper response to the narrative. This is the something that needs to be countered.
Looking then at what existing research tells us about what causes violent radical actions, 4 areas emerge as particularly significant. They can be labelled situational, strategic, ideological, and individual. Starting with situational factors, these may further be broken down into enabling and motivating preconditions of terrorist violence. Still, and even assuming that all of the above may have led to an individual being involved in a group with violent strategic aims and which feels that what it holds sacred has been violated, it is still not the case that an individual member of such a group will act violently. For example, Anthony Garcia, who was convicted for his part in the 2004 fertilizer bomb plot, and his older brother were both members of the same radical Islamic group. Yet while his older brother was apparently the more deeply committed to the group's ideology, only Anthony acted violently. Economic background, relative assimilation into host cultures, apparent ideological background, and other seemingly important factors all, at the end of the day, fail to account for why some people act violently and others do not. The individual factors constantly emerge as unpredictable elements which foil any attempt to predict who will resort to violence, and which foil the attempts of so-called theories of radicalization to accurately account for violent behavior, other than in retrospect.
I would like to make a general point that we can make a great deal, it makes a great deal of sense to draw on the wealth of research produced by scholars of new religions to understand the current situation, in particular the new Islamic movements. I would like to make 3 major points with respect to this research. First of all, the new Islamic beliefs can find appeal among some predominantly young people, not only because they're Islamic, but also because they are new. And provide a basis for creating alternative space for social experimentation and efforts at social change. Second, tensions are likely to occur as a result of it, as has always been the case with new religions, because an establishment of any new religion is also a kind of creating of a new us versus the existing them divide. Or it can do the other way around, depending on how you look at it. We should approach these tensions and even conflicts associated with them as an interactive rather than one-way process in which the wider society is a party. And thirdly, I would argue in strongest possible terms that while a connection between these tensions in the wider society and violence can be discovered, it should not be assumed to apply wherever such tensions are found.
So tonight I want to make 3 brief points. The first is that I don't personally believe or agree with the rather simplistic, if fashionable, view that says religion is the cause or key driver of radicalisation. And I believe much of the commentary that tries to link increased religiosity to extremism or radicalisation or terrorism misses the wood from the trees. Just to give one example, my favourite example, back in June 2004, at the 12th and final public hearing of the 9/11 Commission in the United States, a phalanx of law enforcement and intelligence officials from the US government arrived to give their testimony. And Lee Hamilton, the vice chair of the commission, a former Democratic congressman, he asked them, he said, you've looked at and examined the lives of these people as closely as anybody. What have you found out about why these men did what they did? What motivated them to do it? The answers to these questions were provided by Supervisory Special Agent James Fitzgerald of the FBI, who had led the 9/11 investigation for the agency. He said, I believe they feel a sense of outrage against the United States. They identify with the Palestinian problem, they identify with people who oppose oppressive regimes, and I believe they tend to focus their anger on the United States. No mention of religion, no mention of Islam, no mention of virgins in heaven, 72 or otherwise. For the lead investigators from the US government into the 9/11 attacks, politics, not faith, was the key motivating factor. That's not to say that religion wasn't or isn't a contributing factor to radicalization, to the radicalization of young Muslim men specifically. But it's one of many, and it's never been the main one. This leads me to my second point. If there was a clear-cut, clearly delineated link, a causal connection between religion, between faith, specifically Islam, and radicalization, extremism, terrorism, then why are there so few Muslim terrorists around? And that leads me to my third and final point, which relates, I think personally, to the most important statement that was made today in the presentations by Matthew, that, quote, there is a growing consensus amongst scholars that there is in fact no conveyor belt into radicalization, no theory that can predict exactly when or where it will occur. Exactly. And why is it such an important statement? Because we have a government, a conservative-led, centre-right coalition government, which has based its entire counter-extremism, counter-terrorism strategy on this so-called, and I would argue, mythical conveyor belt.
My own working definition thus far has been, and I'm open to correction, I'm not casting anything in stone here, is that it's the process of adopting theopolitical ideas that can lead to violence. So radicalization is the process of adopting theopolitical ideas that can lead to violence. So what's theopolitics? Theopolitics, again, is the intersection where a certain theology, a certain reading of religion informs political ideology. So there is a merger of religion and politics. This focus that it must always be on violence. Now, I'm not a Tory nor am I a Liberal Democrat, so it's not in my gift to be defending the current government. But what I will say is, once it reaches the stage of violent expression, it's too late. It's far too late. And by then, it's not really your and my business anymore. It's over to the FBI and their equivalent here, the special branch and the police and everyone else. The least we can do is, if we know someone's committed to at that stage terrorism, tip off the local authorities, just as we would a murderer or a rapist or a paedophile, because they then become criminals. But it's too late by then. I think there are things that can be done beforehand, but those aren't necessarily initiatives that must be government-led. And I think some of the debate is too state-centric, in that we're dependent on government to take the lead, and we're dependent on government to provide training and everything else, whereas much of this can be civil society, and I'll come to that in a moment. But just as we don't accept anti-Semitism, if someone attacks verbally Jewish people, we would challenge it. We don't necessarily think it's acceptable. Just as we don't accept homophobia, if someone attacks gay people verbally, we would challenge it, undermine it. Just as we challenge sexism, we don't wait for someone to become a rapist, but if someone's expressing sexist ideas in the public domain, we would challenge it, contain it, undermine it, make it morally repulsive, unacceptable. Why is it that we're prepared to stand by and say, if someone's attacking in certain places what's called a kuffar, derogatory term for non-Muslims, that somehow it's acceptable that we can stand by and say, oh yes, to hell with the kuffar, oh yes, the kuffar are dirty, and the hatred that comes out of some quarters vis-a-vis non-Muslims, that somehow that's acceptable, but other forms aren't. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that government should be constantly involved in this, but my contention is, if we're prepared to challenge other forms of bigotry, intolerance, and hatred, we too should be out there publicly prepared to challenge in a civil society context, in a civilized context, not necessarily spying and handing them over to the authorities, but bigotry wherever it comes. And if that bigotry expresses itself as bigotry towards non-Muslims, that too should be challenged, not tolerated.
I actually quite agree with you that it's impossible to separate religion and politics within kind of religious worldviews. Ed, in his Islamist says that Hizb ut-Tahrir saw all natural events as acts of God, yeah? Page 101. Yeah. And at the same time, it has identifiable political goals. And we will get nowhere if we try kind of to prescribe what is politics and sort of separate religion and politics. As well as, this is why I disagree with you, or have rather reservations with Ed about what Ed said about sort of radical beliefs as potentially leading to violence, and we should kind of include it in our definition. Yes, radical beliefs can lead to violence, but radical beliefs is also, for many young people, is the only way to express their desire for change. They are, by definition, that's another definition of radical.
Thank you.
Being radical, trying to change something. So by sort of not addressing this issue, avoiding this issue, we will get nowhere. The real question is, how can we create a kind of public and social space to accommodate these radical beliefs?
Just very quickly on the point Ed makes about the future of terrorism, you mentioned Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, etc. For me, there's one country that's going to turn it all around, that's Iran. If we go to war with Iran, you will have exactly what happened with Iraq, in that you will have a whole new generation of terrorists, radicals, extremists, both at home and abroad. And again, the cause will be geopolitical, not theopolitical.
I'm Daniel Nilsson Ahanas from Bristol University, and I'm really glad that Mehdi Hassan mentioned social networks and Mark Sageman's research in particular, because I think so far we've really privileged a very individual and atomistic sort of perspective in most presentations, I think, which in a sense makes us privilege theological and rational sort of counter-radicalization approaches. So I was just wondering if people would agree that, that the movement to violence is a social process, and if that's the case, what implications does that have for countering that movement?
On the point about social networks, I mean, I find the stuff, Mark Sageman's stuff, fascinating. I think it's very important. And it's important because you've got security services, we talked about earlier, how do you identify people, looking in the wrong places. If you assume, as in the United States for a long period, that mosques were the hotbeds of terrorism, which they're not, as Ed's pointed out, both in Britain and America, and the empirical evidence shows that, and you're looking in the wrong place when actually it's groups of young men who are coming together through kinship or friendship or bonding. And those of you who haven't seen Chris Morris's film Four Lions, I think it should be compulsory viewing for anybody working in the counterintelligence, counter-extremism field. In particular, the scene where the police turn up at the house of his brother, the big bearded Salafi, to arrest him, rather than the irreligious younger brother who's actually plotting the terror attack.
If I just take the question on de-radicalization, 3 or 4 things seem to be the general trend, having added those caveats. One is age, just simply growing up and realizing that there's more to life than just going around uttering bizarre statements and expecting others to do so and take things to the logical conclusion. Second is the injection of doubt. One of the things I found most instructive is when I was in Syria and Saudi Arabia and meeting people who were of the extreme Salafi wing here in the UK, but once they reached Syria and Saudi Arabia, they met Muslim scholars who were rooted in Muslim history and theology, but looked at the world in different terms. Having that argument put to them and therefore injecting doubt in their certainty helped over time nourish those minds to be far more de-radicalized. Without sounding too extensive, I'd throw one more in, and that's women. Falling in love, getting married, and everything that follows has had a positive impact, not just on younger radicals that I knew growing up, who are now more or less family men and with other responsibilities, but also the Israelis have used that with Hamas. Some of the more extreme Hamas members have been facilitated with marriage and whatever else, and that seems to have taken out a certain sting.
It didn't help Bin Laden.
Well, I did say it doesn't apply with everyone.